Folks, welcome back to Nodevember day 13. Prompt for this one was cabin, and I was inspired to do something a bit more two-dimensional, similar to the last one. Again, in a different style. I used to do a lot of 2D painting with Critter, and then later as well with heavy paint on the iPad, and you just get some really nice sort of flat-looking effects, what you can do. Maybe a bit inspired by the old vintage national park posters in America. Yeah, I just wanted something that was really flat, and there's quite an easy way to do this. Also, this is the first time I was doing anything this month where I thought, damn, I really wish I was just modeling this by hand, because it was such simple geometry and it was so kind of overcomplicated to create all of the systems to model it procedurally. But there we go. So did a simple layout with just like a box and a plane to work out my composition, set up the camera, and then did a little bit of, not exactly sculpting, but SDF based landscaping. So I took a big box, took an icosphere out of it to create the pond area, added a few icospheres in the background to create variation. Then I made a little rock generator, which is just essentially like an icosphere which has Voronoi distance from edge inverted as the displacement. So you get these like little bulges with ridges in between them, and then a little bit of noise mixed in there as well. And the way that I set that up was so that it could be used as a more general system. I ended up using menu switches or index switches, which allowed me to manually position, rotate, set seeds, set radius for each of the rocks. But I equally could have just duplicated the node group for that. So once I'd got my rocks more or less laid out where I wanted them, I made a very basic tree. So a couple of actual splines which I hand positioned for the main hero shapes of the trunk. That you really want to do that manually so that you can set up your composition nicely, especially with the treehouse, because I wanted it to support the treehouse underneath. And then I also just instanced some additional splines on those. Curve to mesh to create some volume to them, and then did mesh to STF, fillet, STF to mesh, and that gives me a nice remeshed shape. The tree canopy is a very simple, old school game method, probably actually still how they do it in a lot of games. Creating the volume, or like the composition for your tree canopy with a bunch of spheres, and then did an additional step where I instanced smaller spheres to sort of break it up a little bit, and then instancing within all of that a bunch of cards which face the camera. So these are just billboards, which we're going to stick a sprite on later in the shader. So they all face the camera, and then I transfer the normal from the big spheres, which set the canopy shape, onto those cards, just to make sure that when we pass our light onto it, or when we're using our normals later, we're going to be able to direct it by sort of like the volume of the canopy rather than it being just flat cards. So once I'd done that, I threw in some grass, again, super basic, just instance a bunch of curve lines, distort them, then curve to mesh with another curve line as the profile to give me a nice ribbon. Creating the decking is just instancing a bunch of curve lines again, using a quadrilateral as the profile this time. And then to make the structure for the treehouse, I made a little cube with a gizmo. A very simple setup here, but it just lets me hand position in the viewport. I kind of run out of patience a little bit because it was just individually positioning specific things. Like proceduralism is fantastic, but it is definitely not for everything. You get a lot of complexity and you can work at a much higher scale than you would normally work if you're doing traditional modeling. But when you are doing something which is very simple, sometimes you do just want to make it yourself and hand position and really author that stuff. So the cabin, again, to be fair, quite nice as a procedural process, because I could just take the shape of the cabin, cut up the walls, and then rotate the planks individually around their own centers without me needing to sort of intervene there. And then I wanted to create some windows, something fairly basic, just like a little grid setup. So I just took a grid and isolated the horizontal and vertical lines and made them into curves, and then curve to mesh with a quadrilateral, and then plonked that down, put a gizmo on it as well, just so I could hand position in the viewport. It's really nice now we have gizmos to just have a little bit more of that kind of 3D viewport control. For the ladder and the railings around the treehouse, I wanted to have it look like kind of strokey, like a paintbrush, where you're trying to make a thin line, and as your hand shakes, if you're not completely steady, you get a little bit of variation in the line weight. So I literally just took a curve line and then put a curve circle as the radius, as the profile, and then used a random value for the radius. So it's just basically changing for each point that it comes to. Background is just a few curves. with a curve profile of a curve line, so that it's basically just creating these walls in the background. And I did 4 of them, or maybe 5 of them, stepped back and just instanced a bunch of planes on them. And I'm going to use the same texture as the canopy. So as we come into the shader now, I basically just dumped on a whole load of flat colors onto everything, just masking things out with I used named attributes in geometry nodes to create masks for each section. And then the tree canopy shader is essentially just a Voronoi pattern, a little bit distorted, but when you plug the position into the Voronoi, then the position output from the Voronoi becomes the sort of like the Voronoi centers from each cell. So then you can use that as like your leaves. So you can use the distance, whatever you want to use. So you can use distance from that position to create a gradient from the center. This becomes how we blend out our leaves towards the edges, and use that as a threshold for our the distance gradient coming out of the Voronoi, which is the value from the center of each of our cells. So you can use that for all of the background leaves and the tree canopy cards. And then for all of like the rocks and things like this and the tree trunk, I've just taken literally like the surface normal, plugged into the vector of the Voronoi, and then the Voronoi position output becomes essentially like it looks like a painterly normal setup, like it's all broken up and it's more into cells, but it still sort of follows the geometry. It's a really nice way of doing it. I think it's fairly common to do that, to create painterly normals. And then you can just pass this out through a dot product. I'm using the normal node, which has a dot product output and just has like a little sphere that you can rotate. Kind of a nice way to do it. So this is Phong shading, PHONG. So rather than actually using lighting in my scene, I'm just basing this like vector direction fake lighting for the normal. So it compares the direction and the vector that we've put in against the direction of the normal. And when they're similar, it gives us a higher value. And when they're less similar, it gives a lower value. You can just pass that gradient into a color ramp. So I'm making all my color decisions around the sort of purple green palette with the highlights of the orange. When you're working with color, if you're not used to color, if you don't have a 2D or a traditional art painting background, if you're not used to thinking about color palettes, I would recommend that you find some art that you like, and you can literally just copy what they're doing with color. I think it's perfectly valid. Think about it, try and understand why what they're doing works, but it's just so it can get messy if you start throwing too many colors onto something, especially something like this where you want a nice 2D, almost like screen printed look. So not everything is based on the normals. I did as much as I could with the normals, but sometimes I needed some additional custom shadowing and things like this, so I just used distance gradients. Some of those distance gradients were coming through Voronois as well, just to make sure that they were a bit broken up. Let me put extra shadowing underneath the decking. Let me put shadowing into the foreground. Let me put an extra highlight underneath the water. The water as well is very simple. Everything in this scene is just either emission or transparency. So the leaf cards in the trees, they are just flat emission with an alpha mask for the transparency. And then the water, we've got some floating leaves, which is just like a noise pattern and a gradient to set like a full opacity section. And then the rest of it is like 30% opacity, and it's just green. The cabin, the texturing on it was actually, I wasn't really sure how to do it, but ended up finding a nice little strategy here where I took a Voronoi texture and I took a high detail noise, which was stretched in the Z-axis, and used that to control the Voronoi scale. And that gave me, you can equally just do it to displace the Voronoi coordinates, but that gave me a nice like vertical stretched texture. And then for the shadow of the front of the porch, the canopy section, I just literally used position gradients, my X and my Z, and combined those together to create the peaked shadow. Passed that back through Voronoi so that I could break up some of those edges to look a bit more painterly. And then, yeah, that just became my shadow mask for the front of the treehouse. Added some additional gradients to the back of the treehouse as well, just to make it a bit darker where it's coming close to the tree. You can imagine that like a bit of fake ambient occlusion. And underneath the tree as well, I wanted a little bit of bounce lighting to come back up off the decking and hit the bottom of those branches, give it a bit of warmth. So I also added a bit of a gradient around there based on those Voronoi normals. I think that's basically it. For the compositor setup, I sent via AOVs, I sent a mask for my tree canopy, leaves, and the rocks. And then I just did a simple box mask based on the coordinates, the image coordinates, to give me a nice little border. And then added to that mask my tree and my rocks, just so that those things were able to go outside of the main painted area right to the edges. Multiplied everything by a high detail, high roughness noise texture, which makes it look like it's on paper, and then added just the very highlights from that noise texture over the top of everything to make it look like it was printed and a bit relieved. And that's it. That's how you do this look. It's very simple. It's pretty adaptable. It looks nice. I like it. I'm happy with how it came out. So there we go. Hope you learned something. Hope you had fun. And I'll catch you in the next one.